This podcast shares powerful stories from survivors of sexual assault. But what if we could stop some of those stories from happening in the first place? That's the idea behind Hassle. I'm Amy Watson, founder of Hassle, and I created it to focus on prevention, engaging men, workplaces and communities to challenge harmful behaviour before it escalates, instead of placing the responsibility on women to stay safe. In just over a year, we've built a movement of more than 550,000 people, reached over 250 million views, gathered more than 9,000 surveys to inform our work, and grown a network of over 3,000 ambassadors across more than 120 countries. If you'd like to hear me talk more about prevention and culture change, you can listen to episode 175 of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, or you can learn more at Hassle, that's HASSL.UK.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. I'm your host, Dave Markel, and this is episode 188. Today's episode is one that I want you to listen to carefully, because it challenges a lot of what people think they understand about rape, consent, and what victimization actually looks like. This is a conversation about coercion. Yes, we've talked about this before. Several previous guests on this show have been survivors of coercive sexual assault and rape. But today, we define it in a way that puts a different perspective on coercive pressure and about the manipulation that doesn't always look violent, but leaves very real trauma behind. This story comes with a perpetrator mindset that actually at one point acknowledges the coercion, and it forces us to confront a hard truth. Not all coercive rape looks the way people expect it to. Sometimes it originates from a source who is in therapy, who appears to have high emotional IQ, and who portrays an enlightened perspective. My guest today is Martha Gagnon. She is a survivor, an advocate, and the founder of Define Consent Iowa, where she actively works to change outdated sexual assault laws. But what she shares in this episode goes far beyond advocacy. She walks us through an experience that many people still struggle to come to grips with, understand, or even believe. This is Martha's story, told in her way, in her time, and in her words. Here's Martha. Hey, SAS listeners, I'm with Martha Gagnon. Let me welcome you to the show, and I'm glad you're here. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Do you remember how it is that we started communicating?
I think we both reached out to each other, actually. So it was kind of serendipitous. Yeah.
And I think it was quite a while ago, if I remember correctly. It was back in December. I think some of our earliest emails were way back then. And it's kind of funny how things work out. And it's just taken a while for us to sit down like this and do an episode. But
yeah.
Again, thank you for being willing to do this.
Thank you.
Tell my audience about yourself, if you don't mind, just some history and some background.
I grew up in Iowa, and I am a sexual assault and domestic violence survivor and advocate, and I'm the founder of Define Consent Iowa. We are a grassroots initiative fighting to update the outdated sexual assault laws here in Iowa. I'm working on that. And I found your podcast sometime last year. It really moved me. I just felt like the space you create here it's so clearly safe and trauma informed. And I think the fact that you're a retired detective as well is such a unique and meaningful perspective. So I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. And thank you for finding the podcast. I don't know how you found it, but I'm glad you did. I appreciate those kind words about it. And you're right. It has become what I had hoped and conceived of in my head, which, as you mentioned, is a safe place and a community, but it's also an educational platform. And so one of the reasons I'm very thankful that you're here is to talk about your advocacy and your work with your foundation and what you're doing to change laws in Iowa and hopefully all over the place. I've got other people who have been on this show that are doing some of that same kind of work in different areas. So I appreciate what you're doing. I think it helps in multiple layers. In general terms, what it does from my perspective is it helps bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault and interpersonal violence. You mentioned domestic violence issues. So we'll talk about that also. Is there anything else you'd like to make sure the audience knows about you before we get into what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, I guess just a little backstory before I get into my story and what I'll be talking about. I think one important thing I want people to know is that I had already been in 2 abusive relationships before I had this experience. One was very overt, a lot of anger, yelling, physical violence. And the other one was much more covert. So he was seemingly very charming and gentle and devoted, and turned out to be living multiple secret lives with other long-term girlfriends and a wife and a young child. So he was a very skilled liar. And coming out of those experiences, I really threw myself into healing. I did years of therapy, EMDR, internal family systems, NARM, which is the neuroaffective relational model, group coaching, and a lot of reading. And eventually I got to a point where I felt like not only had I healed from that trauma, but I had repaired the parts of myself that had kept me stuck in those dynamics. And I really thought that I was ready to build something healthy and real with someone good. That was the foundation of the story I'll be telling today.
I think that's important. I appreciate you laying some of that groundwork, because much of that then feeds into mindset and worldview and hopes and dreams and actions that we take. And then we look back and we go, oh, wow, this influenced that, that influenced this. Yeah, I think that's important. And I'm glad you recognized that and brought it up. Those 2 things, like even me becoming a cop to begin with, I think a lot of that had to do with my sexual and physical abuse growing up. It was kind of a thought process unbeknownst to me. I mean, I wasn't thinking actively like, oh, I'm going to become a cop. But when the opportunity arose, I leaned into it and thought, this will work. This is something that I need to do. It wasn't so much an idea of retaliation or wanting to get back at the world for me being bullied, but it was more of a, I can help other people who I see and recognize are in my same situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even understand that until talking with a good friend of mine who was a psychologist and a sex assault researcher. And he pointed that out. This is why I became what I am. This is probably why you became a cop.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see what you're saying in terms of where you are going with your foundation and with what you're trying to accomplish, having a foundation based on your past experiences. So it'll be interesting to get that perspective from you. And I don't want to do all the talking. So I'm going to ask you the question that I usually start off with most of my guests. And that is, Martha, what are you able to tell us about your rape or sex assault experience?
I'll just start from the beginning. Coming out of these years of abusive relationships and then several years of healing work, I really wanted to meet my person and build a life with them. And that was my ultimate goal. And that was when I met my now ex. We met through a mutual friend, and I instantly felt a connection. I learned that we had been on kind of parallel paths with going through difficult breakups and then dedicating ourselves to healing and growth. He had also done a lot of therapy. He was into meditation and spirituality. He would talk very candidly about the mistakes he had made in his previous relationships and the work he had done to grow since then. And he even had a degree in psychology. So he just came across as someone who was very emotionally intelligent. He also spoke very highly of his exes and all the women in his life. He made me laugh a lot. He made me feel safe and seen. He was very outgoing and charismatic. I felt like I could just completely be myself around him. I could tell him anything and he would never judge me. So it was really green flag after green flag.
Yeah, yeah.
And very early on, I became convinced that this was my person. And this was my first really big mistake because I believed I knew him. I thought I knew his heart, his character, the kind of husband he would be someday. Looking back, I can see how I just wanted so badly for it to be real that I really overlooked how little time we'd actually spent together. And I just believed the version of himself that he was showing me. And I think I kind of mistook everything for something deeper and safer than it really was. So the abuse started very gradually at first. There were just little things I noticed, like he would make little mean comments about my body or accuse me of lying and hiding things about other men, or he would start arguments that went nowhere and felt like the conflict was the point rather than hearing each other and working towards resolution. And I also noticed that when I said no to sex, he would not accept my no. He would ask over and over and over, and then get upset when I wouldn't give in. And he would say things like, come on, maybe you'll get in the mood if we just start. Or framing it as my responsibility to meet his needs. And I made excuses for all of this behavior because it didn't match the version of himself that he had presented. And I told myself, this behavior isn't who he really is. It's something he's going through, and I should support his growth and not take it personally. And I felt mildly annoyed that he was so pushy with sex, but I didn't think it was a big deal. I've always been very stubborn, very strong-willed. I don't do things that I don't want to do. And I've never had a problem saying no to men. So I just thought everything else about him is so great. And no one is perfect. And these little quirks are not deal breakers. But things kept escalating. So when I didn't give in, he would erupt and he would argue and yell for hours. And he would frame these fights as telling me the hard truths that no one else would. So pathologizing me, weaponizing my past traumas against me. He would say things like, what is it about you that makes men abuse you? You're the common denominator. And you're on a lower stage of ego development. You don't have the emotional maturity to be a good partner.
Wow. Some pretty strong attitudes and language there.
It is. Yes. And, you know, over time, this got in my head. I thought, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not as healed as I thought. Maybe I need to keep working on myself. And these fights became so intense that they were triggering my fight or flight response. And I was exhausted, sleep deprived, really just emotionally worn down. And no matter what I did to try to soothe him or de-escalate, these fights were never over until he decided they were over. So sometimes they would even spill into the next day. And if I tried to take space or go in another room or leave the house, he would say that I had avoidant attachment and that removing myself from the conversation was me abusing him. And this was all very confusing at the time. Looking back now, what I didn't understand was that this pattern of pressure, punishment, and wearing me down was coercion. And eventually, this led to rape. So there was one night shortly after he had moved into my house, he started pressuring me for sex. I said no again and again. And I could see him starting to get angry. And I knew exactly what was coming. It was the hours-long fight that I felt I couldn't escape. At that point, I was so worn down that I didn't think my nervous system could survive another fight. So I gave in. He put me face down on the floor of my living room and pushed my face into the rug and had sex with me. And as soon as it started, I knew it was very wrong. But I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I wasn't participating at all. Finally, at some point, I found my voice and I said, I don't want to do this. Can we please stop? And he said, if we don't do it now, we're doing it again before bed. And again, I just felt like I didn't have a choice and I couldn't handle the thought of doing this all again later. So I gave in again. At one point, towards the end, I started crying and he still kept going. Afterwards, I remember I was sitting on the couch crying. I was extremely distressed. And I was telling him, hey, I don't know what just happened, but that was not okay. I didn't want that. I feel really violated. And he said, yeah, I knew you didn't want that. But very quickly, he told me that I was overreacting and being crazy. He said it didn't happen like I thought. He said he got consent and that it was my fault for having poor boundaries. He even said at one point, you're acting like I raped you. And I thought, well, I didn't use that word. And then I was the one comforting him, telling him that he was a good person and he wasn't a rapist and he wasn't a monster. So after this, I asked him to go stay with a friend for a few days so that I could try to process what happened. And just as a little side note, he would later use that against me many times to say that I had abandoned him, I had kicked him out of my house when he was vulnerable, and I was abusive for doing that. So I was a wreck. I couldn't eat or sleep or get out of bed for a few days. I was crying nonstop. I was having major mood swings. I felt very anxious, depressed, and just very confused. And I had asked him for no contact, but he called and texted me relentlessly. He sent me these long messages saying how we were meant to be together. We had such a deep connection, and I was throwing it all away. Then he started showing up to my house, bringing me flowers, mowing my lawn, cleaning my house. And I felt so confused. I blamed myself for what had happened. The conclusion I came to was that this was not rape. I was convinced I had just traumatized myself by disrespecting my own boundaries, and that the level of distress I felt must be an overreaction, just like he said. And looking back, I have often wondered if he really had given me time and space to process, would I have seen that violation for what it was? And I wonder if he knew that, and he knew what he had done, and he had to maintain control and keep me confused so that I wouldn't see the truth. Eventually, I just buried the trauma and I let him come home. And we stayed in a relationship. A couple weeks later, we went on a camping trip with a group of friends, and we were smiling and laughing and affectionate. And to anyone watching, we looked like a couple in love. And I think I was trying to convince myself of that. Yeah. It's like if I could just act like it never happened, then maybe I could forget about it. Mm-hmm. So after this first incident, things didn't get better. This continued for the remainder of the relationship. We were together about a year. And this happened over and over. Sometimes I stood my ground and I chose the verbal and emotional abuse because my body couldn't handle being violated again. And sometimes I chose the sex I didn't want because my nervous system couldn't handle the punishment for saying no. And I really felt that those were my only two options. Eventually, the abuse became physical too. So he would grab my wrists and restrain me so I couldn't get away. He would block doorways when I tried to leave. He kicked furniture across the room. And I tried so hard to get him to see what he was doing and how he was harming me. We had so many conversations about consent. I genuinely believed maybe he just never learned about consent and he doesn't actually understand that he's hurting me. But he would argue with me and he would say, no one else has ever complained. Women like it when I'm pushy. It gets me what I want, so why would I ever change? I think he just didn't see any problem with it and felt very justified in his behavior. Eventually, I learned the term sexual coercion. And I thought, okay, that's what's happening here. He's pressuring me after I've said no. That's sexual coercion. So it felt good to put a name to it, but something about it didn't fully capture the weight of the damage I felt, which just then reinforced this belief that maybe I was overreacting and I was crazy and it wasn't that big of a deal. At one point, he even admitted to being sexually coercive. He acknowledged the damage he was doing. He apologized. He seemed to take full accountability, and he even worked on it in his therapy. And for a short time, things seemed better. And I thought maybe we had turned a corner and we'd finally have the relationship that I'd always dreamed of. But it started up again, and this time it was even more insidious and harder to identify. So instead of picking a fight right after I said no, he would wait a few hours, or he would make the fight about something unrelated to being denied sex. So it became harder to tie it back to this is happening because I said no. But the pattern was still there. Every time I said no, there were consequences. So there were also many times during sex that I would tell him to stop because I was just done or he was hurting me, and he wouldn't stop. And he would say things like, I hate it when you complain. Just submit to me and take it. Be more feminine. Make your body go limp. Can't you at least pretend that you're enjoying it? I don't care if you have to fake it. So eventually, my body completely rejected him. I stopped wanting sex entirely. I hated doing it. Nothing about it was remotely enjoyable for me. And I would communicate this to him, and I would tell him, I don't want sex anymore because you're not nice to me. You yell at me, you belittle me, you violate my boundaries. And if you can make me feel safer, that might change. Then I might actually want to. But he was never interested in that. And I remember one of his explanations was that I remember he said, "You're not withholding because of anything I'm doing." He said, "You're punishing me because I'm so popular and you're insecure about dating someone like me."
Wow.
Sometimes I would also reference the first incident where I felt so violated and how I never really got over it. And he would get angry that I was still hurt. And he would refer to it as the time he got consent. So the sexual coercion was happening inside a much broader pattern of abuse. There were many more forms of abuse happening: gaslighting, isolation, monitoring my phone, sleep deprivation, and just constantly being made to feel like I was the problem. I remember being in a hotel on vacation and I was curled up in the fetal position, sobbing, begging him to stop this hours-long verbal attack and stop telling me how horrible and stupid I was. I remember Christmas morning, our families were meeting for the first time, and he kept me in his bedroom for an hour, calling me a stupid bitch and threatening to break up with me on Christmas. And I was getting texts from my mom saying, "Hey, where are you guys?" And I remember so many times him trying to convince me that something he had done that I had a very clear memory of had never happened, and that I was crazy and I couldn't trust my own memory and my own reality. Throughout the relationship, there were many, many times I thought about leaving or even made attempts to leave. But there were a lot of factors keeping me stuck. So, for one, I was experiencing extreme cognitive dissonance. I couldn't reconcile the harm that he was causing with this self-aware, emotionally intelligent therapy guy that I had met in the beginning. And his apologies were so convincing. He would use all the right language. He seemed genuinely remorseful. And for a moment, I would see these glimpses of who I thought he really was. And that's what I would hold on to. Yeah. I knew that I was being abused. I knew this was abuse. But I told myself that it was a communication problem, not a character problem. And that if I could just find the right words and explain it a new way, he would finally understand and stop, because he loved me and he just wasn't getting it. What I didn't understand back then was that abusers do know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And they do it because it benefits them. And they have no real incentive to change. But that sunk cost fallacy kept me really stuck too. I felt like I had invested so much energy and pain and trauma, and I'm just going to leave right when things might finally turn around. He also had convinced me that I was the reason he was this way, that he'd never acted like this before. But with me, he finally felt safe enough to heal his old wounds. He said he was treating me this way because he loved me so much. It was very twisted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We even were seeing a relationship coach at one point who we did IFS or parts work with her, and she convinced me that I should be holding space for him while he's abusing me, and that I actually had this very special opportunity to guide him in his healing. She was not a licensed therapist, by the way. I want to be clear about that. And I just never had time or space to get clarity. I was always stuck in the chaos, constantly confused, feeling like I had no grip on reality. And then, of course, like all abusive relationships, it wasn't bad 100% of the time. There were periods where things felt really good. And I held on to those moments so desperately. I know now that those nice phases are actually part of the cycle of abuse.
Right.
But I was just clinging to that hope and potential. And that had always been my pattern long before I met him. So when I finally ended the relationship, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't even bring up the abuse. I just remember telling him, I hate myself. I hate who I've become in this relationship. But leaving wasn't clean. I'm sure you've heard it takes survivors an average of 7 attempts to leave.
Yeah, that's statistically the number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, felt like closer to 20.
Mm-hmm.
It was so hard. So what followed after the breakup was this period of post-separation abuse. And the verbal and emotional abuse escalated. He started stalking and harassing me. So he would drive past my house multiple times a day, follow me in his car. He was tracking my location. He tried to break into my house multiple times. He showed up in a rage and he grabbed me and pushed me, tried to force his way into my house, and took my phone when I was trying to call 911. But I kept going back, partly because, as twisted as this sounds, having him close felt safer than the escalation that came every time I tried to create distance. We also shared a dog, and I felt really guilty for keeping the dog from him. And he made sure that I knew how horrible everyone thought I was for keeping her from him. There was one time he was at my house and he tried to initiate sex, and I said no. He started pushing and pressuring me, but I refused. And then he pulled me into his lap and restrained my arms. He was groping me and touching me while I was yelling, "Stop." And I was able to get away and told him to leave, and he did. But it was so clear then that his sexually coercive behavior was escalating to physical force, and that this wasn't going to stop. And that was kind of the turning point for me. I finally blocked him for good. I was exhausted past the point of being afraid of what he would do next. I just couldn't do it anymore. And when he continued contacting me, I filed for a protection order. And it helped. After that, I just kept a low profile and stopped going out as much because I was still really afraid of running into him. But the direct contact finally stopped. So once I got away for good, I finally had the time and space to begin to process everything and get some clarity. I was working through a lot of different aspects of the abuse, but the one thing that had always stuck with me that I never got over was how I always felt so sexually violated and used by him. That first incident on my living room floor was etched into my memory, and it haunted me. And this was when I started asking myself, could that have been rape? I felt like my body had always known that it was, but he never physically forced me. It didn't look like this violent thing that you see on TV. The first time I talked about it, I couldn't even speak the words out loud. So I went on Reddit and I made a post and I just said, here's exactly what happened from start to finish. Was this rape? And dozens of people responded and said, yes, 100%. It's called coercive rape. And a lot of people said, I experienced this over and over and over in my relationship. And so that word finally landed. And after feeling confused about this for so long, it was like returning to the story that my body was telling me the whole time. And I finally saw the truth that he was not actually the man I saw in the very beginning. He was the man who violated my body and my boundaries and my trust over and over. Accepting this truth was pretty soul crushing. And I went into a really dark place. I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I experienced a really major collapse. I couldn't eat or sleep for months. I had a lot of flashbacks and nightmares, panic attacks, really severe anxiety and depression. At one point, I was having suicidal ideations, and I didn't feel safe anywhere. I was still scared that he might show up at my house again. And everywhere in my own home reminded me of a different traumatic event. Like the living room rug that he first raped me on, or my bedroom where I was assaulted so many more times, or the bathroom where I tried to hide during a fight and he forced his way in and hit me in the face with the door. I didn't feel safe in my body either. I lost a lot of weight and I couldn't stand looking at myself in the mirror. I didn't even recognize myself. I felt like all I could see was the damage he had left. And I struggled so much with blaming myself. I felt like an imposter. I remember joining a support group and hearing these other women's stories week after week and thinking they are real victims. They couldn't have stopped their assaults. I let this happen to me. He never forced me. I could have just walked away. I felt guilty for even being in that group. Like I had taken a spot from someone who deserved it more than me. And honestly, even now, sometimes that thought still creeps in that maybe it wasn't bad enough. And I know I'm not the only survivor who feels that way. And I think that's why coercive rape is so insidious, because it's designed to make you believe that you were a willing participant in your own violation. It doesn't leave bruises, it leaves confusion and self-blame. So I started learning more about coercion and how a yes given under duress is not true consent. And no, 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 yes is not consent. And that agreeing to sex you don't want because you don't feel safe saying no is not consent. And sex that happens under any of these circumstances is rape. I learned about the fawn response, which, for anyone who's not familiar, it's where your nervous system decides that compliance is the safest option when you can't fight or escape. And it's an involuntary trauma response. And that explained why I went along with things that I didn't want. And I learned that this is so common in victims of coercive control and domestic violence. So this helped me to start letting go a little bit of some of that self-blame and imposter syndrome. Another thing that helped me so much was learning about rape trauma syndrome, which is a type of PTSD that's really common in anyone who has experienced some level of sexual trauma. And it has 3 phases. The acute phase, where you're in survival mode immediately after the assault. And then the underground phase, where you bury the trauma and return to daily life. And this can last for weeks or months or even decades. And then the reconciliation phase, where you finally face what happened and begin to heal. So understanding this framework helped me make sense of my own experience and why I stayed after the first assault, and why the full weight of the trauma didn't actually hit me until over a year later. And I think it also explains why delayed reporting is so common with these types of crimes. So as the full gravity of what happened was settling in, I became very overwhelmed by the fear of him hurting someone else. And I felt that I really needed to try to stop that from happening. So when I decided to report, I wasn't expecting an arrest. I just wanted a record on file. I thought that would help if someone else came forward. And I went into it just fully expecting to be victim blamed and disbelieved. But the officer who took my statement was actually very kind and patient. It was the first time I had said the whole story out loud, and I was having a full-blown panic attack. I could barely get the words out, and he was just so patient. He told me it was okay if I needed to take a break. He said he could get a female officer if I would be more comfortable. But once I started talking about it, I just had to get it all out. And he just showed me a lot of compassion and empathy, which I was surprised. And I do have to acknowledge that I'm a white, middle-class, cisgender woman. I have a certain amount of privilege that probably shaped how I was treated. But the prosecutor I met with later was equally empathetic. Ultimately, though, he determined that what happened to me didn't actually meet Iowa's legal definition of rape. Under the current law, my ex would have had to either physically force me or explicitly threaten bodily injury. He would have had to say out loud with his words, if you don't have sex with me, I will hurt you. So coercion, manipulation, and fear of being emotionally and verbally abused, it's not enough. So it didn't even matter that they believed me because the law said that what he did was legal. My ex later tried to claim that I had made false allegations and it wasn't real rape because it wasn't a crime, which I found this very puzzling because when he addressed this publicly, he didn't actually dispute what happened. He just argued about the label and the legality. But marital rape was legal until 1993. It doesn't mean that everything that happened before 1993 wasn't real marital rape. The law catching up to a harm doesn't retroactively create the harm. The harm always existed. The experience was real. The violation was real. What changed was just the collective willingness to name it and hold people accountable for it. Coercive rape is so normalized that many perpetrators will openly admit to doing it. They just don't call it rape. But I couldn't believe that this wasn't a crime. So I started researching sexual assault laws in the United States, and I learned that these laws vary wildly state by state. I had no idea. So what happened to me in Iowa was completely legal, but 90 miles to the east in Illinois, it would have been a felony. I realized what we were missing here in Iowa was a clear legal definition of consent. So that's why I started Define Consent Iowa, and I'm fighting for updates to the law here. There's another really amazing organization that I've connected with called the Consent Awareness Network, and they're also fighting to add legal definitions of consent to the law all across the United States. They've been doing this for a long time, and they currently have a bill pending in New York, which is huge. And they really kindly have allowed me to use their definition, which was created by their founder, Joyce Short. And she's a real expert in consent in the law. And this definition is really the gold standard. And it is a freely given, knowledgeable, informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason. So this definition would close the gaps in the law so that every type of rape and sexual assault under every circumstance is actually criminalized. Without this, there are countless survivors who just have no path to justice because the law doesn't even recognize what happened to them. And of course, there's so much more work to be done beyond this. As you know very well, there are so many reasons why the criminal justice system fails survivors so routinely. But I think without a legal definition of consent, every other effort is just built on sand. So I also started posting content on Instagram and TikTok about sexual coercion and what this can look like inside of abusive relationships. And I really want to bring visibility to the fact that coercion that leads to sex is rape and sexual assault. Because when I first heard of sexual coercion while it was happening to me, most of what I found online treated it as almost a footnote, like this vague form of emotional abuse, rather than naming it for what it actually is. And I think it is so important to name it because so many survivors go through this and they don't even know what happened to them. All they know is they feel confused and violated, but they think, maybe I'm overreacting. So I really try to make the kind of content that I wish I had found when I was just starting to process my own experience and I was feeling confused and isolated. And I needed a lot of outside validation. What I really needed was to hear someone else say, hey, if you were coerced into sex in your relationship, that was rape. And the damage it caused was real. And your trauma makes sense. I also really want to use my platform to push back against the myth that real rape happens with a stranger in an alley and looks very violent, and the victim screams and fights back, because the majority of the time, this is not the reality. It's estimated that 21% of rapes are committed by an intimate partner. And many of these don't look violent. They look like pressure, manipulation, guilt tripping, implied threats, wearing someone down, ignoring the moment their body stops responding and they dissociate, continuing to use their body while they're frozen and silently crying. This is so common and it's normalized. And it's just as damaging as rape that involves physical force or rape that looks very violent. And I think if there's one thing I really want people to understand about sexual coercion, it's that it doesn't happen because you're weak. It happens because abusers will chip away at your boundaries and your self-esteem and your sense of reality. And they do it so slowly and gradually that you don't even realize what's happening until it's too late. I was already in my mid 30s when this happened to me. I'd already experienced abuse and done years of therapy. I was very strong willed and independent, and I still fell victim to this. Okay, I'm getting towards the end.
You're doing an amazing job. And it's unusual for me to not have some comment at some point that you are so articulate and so on a roll that I just couldn't stop you at all. Don't stop.
Thank you. Thank you. Feels good to get it out.
Yeah.
So I guess the part that I would just like to end with is the healing journey, things that have helped me heal. Some of the things that have helped me heal. Therapy, of course, has been huge, especially EMDR. I also started doing Muay Thai boxing, and this has just helped me get back in my body and feel empowered. And somatic healing in general, walking, yoga, lifting weights, getting massages, just moving and releasing that stuck trauma and talking about it, sharing my story out loud and publicly and hearing other people's stories, connecting with other survivors who have been through similar things.
It's amazing how that works.
Yeah, definitely.
Somebody should do a podcast.
Another thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which has been so healing for me, has been just being believed. When I did first come forward, I faced some backlash and retaliation, which I expected. My ex and his friends called me a liar publicly and privately. But so many people, a lot of them strangers, have gone out of their way to find me and say, hey, I heard your story and I believe you. It just happened again the other day. This woman who I didn't know came up to me on the street and said that to me. That healed something in me, I just got in my car afterwards and cried. And it's coming from a stranger feels like it holds even more weight because they didn't have to do that. I think when I first came forward, for a while, my world felt very small and dangerous. So every time a stranger says, I believe you, it's like this corrective experience where my brain is kind of relearning that the world is safe. So I've been thinking about that a lot, just how much power there is in being believed.
I believe you.
Thank you.
Not only do I believe you, I appreciate you. As I just said, you're so articulate and versed in probably because of all the reading you've done, all the research you've done, but also the personal experiences that you've had that bring you to a point where you are able to talk about this because of your healing in such a way that is so impactful. I just have to say, first off, how terribly, terribly sorry I am for the experiences that you've lived through. It hurts me to the core to think about you and the hundreds of other guests that I've had, but people that I know haven't even been acknowledged or recognized. And that's a huge aspect of what you're talking about, is this absolute recognition of what it is that constitutes coercive rape. It's so controversial. It's so difficult for some people to understand. It's why so many perpetrators don't look at themselves as perpetrators, as you've referenced from your own experience. And it's why, as you mentioned, so many people don't report it. And then when they do, regret reporting it, because your experience with your police officer and your prosecutor is rare.
Mm-hmm.
There are not very many trauma-informed law enforcement personnel out there. It's growing, but part of the issue is what we're talking about here is just that recognition. There's so many in law enforcement who don't want to recognize that coercive control, coercive rape exists because they're perpetrators, or because they don't understand, or because it doesn't make sense to them, or because if it's not in the law, it doesn't exist. And I just have to say that because of your ability to articulate is going to be one of probably the most definitive examples of coercive rape, although I've had many survivors come on this show and talk about it. And I want to acknowledge them for what they've been through and for their boldness and strength in talking about it the way they did. And I'm not trying to diminish what they went through at all in terms of saying that what you're talking about is so articulated, so well articulated. It just, I think, has a lot to do with how misunderstood it is, and how difficult it is to accept for some people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there were probably a couple of 100,000 times I wanted to interrupt and say, let's talk more about that. Because this is such a very deep and not only controversial, but helpful topic that we need to talk about more. It is really hard to get across to people how that power and control wheel that maybe you know about,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people don't. I'm kind of surprised. It was huge back when I first became a cop, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and through probably the early 90s. The power and control wheel was just prominent in talking about domestic violence and rape and sex assault in trainings and circles. And now it's even hard to find on the internet, you know. But it's changed somewhat because of gender recognition and diversity that way. And but it doesn't change the fact of what coercive control is. And I think what's really interesting is how the aspect of grooming plays such a huge part in coercive control, and people don't even recognize that fully yet.
Yeah.
What grooming is and how it works, and the connection. Like you said, perpetrators of this type of abuse and criminal activity know what they're doing, even if they can't label it, even if they aren't educated on it. They know how to manipulate. They know how to control. And I think those are some really important aspects that we could spend hours talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just the victim that they're grooming either. It's everyone around them, because they're presenting this version of themselves that is so convincing, and they can come across like a really good person. So when things come out like this, it's just so hard for people to believe, because it doesn't match what they thought they knew about this person.
It also keeps the wheel turning. It, like you said, that cycle, where there's the flowers and the lawn mowing and the house cleaning and the apologies, the acknowledgement. Yeah, I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. But then go right back to doing that in maybe even more subtle ways. It's amazing how the perpetrator mentality works and how it adapts to those that they're manipulating who are catching on to things and who are recognizing the manipulation. So the manipulator changes tactics so that
Mm-hmm.
it's not as recognized and so that it's more difficult to confront. And the gaslighting increases and the pretending increases and the social interactions change, because not only do they have to change, like you just said, change for the person that they're manipulating and for the victim, but for those around who are watching.
Mm-hmm.
They have to see that those who are watching have to say, oh, he is changing. He's really trying hard. Yeah. But the violation, the abuse, the rape doesn't stop, doesn't diminish even.
Right.
Martha, we could, as I just mentioned a minute ago, we could go on for hours about this. Am I right?
Yeah. Yes.
Tell us more, if you could, about your social media, your reels, your attempts at educating people. And they're not just attempts, they're landing. They're making connection, as you can tell, because total strangers are walking up and telling you, I believe you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how would they know if they're not seeing this stuff or hearing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more about that inspiration and the thought process and planning and actual work that goes into all that, because it's got to be stressful. It's got to be taxing on you to do all that. But also there's got to be some payoff.
There's a lot of payoff. Initially, I did find it to be a little bit stressful because I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to make really good content and make it perfect and put a lot of time and work into it. And
Gee, I can kind of.
I know, yeah, I know you get it. And, eventually what I found was that the more authentic I am, the more I'm just talking out loud things that I think about a lot and just things that come to mind that I think other survivors might also feel this. And I'll just turn it into a video. And those tend to land so much more than these videos that I spend an hour editing. And of course, it's so funny. But yeah, some of them definitely are landing with people, which I'm really grateful for. And at this point, it doesn't feel stressful anymore or like work. I just love doing it. It's something that I think about a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about sexual assault and coercion and coercive control and abusive relationships and abuse tactics and trauma responses and why perpetrators do what they do and why victims respond like they do. All of this is so interesting to me on an intellectual level, but it also helps me so much in my own healing. So I hope that by putting this out there, just all the things that have helped me, maybe it will help other people as well. And I do hear that from people. I get a lot of comments and messages, mostly on TikTok. There seems to be a lot more engagement on TikTok, but so many survivors saying, I experienced this for years and I never knew what it was. I didn't know it had a name. And now everything makes sense. And I feel seen and I have stopped blaming myself. That's so moving for me. Because that's really what I needed when I was first processing this and trying to figure out what happened. I really just needed to hear it from someone else, and I didn't get that. So now being able to do that and knowing that there are some people that it's landing with, it's like, that's really what keeps me going, you know?
Yes, I know that feeling too.
Yeah.
It's fuel to your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And it's motivating and empowering when you get the feedback that you've educated someone or you've helped someone. Huge motivator to not stop doing this, right?
Yeah.
Tell me what you see coming out of this episode for you and what your hopes and dreams are in terms of sitting right where you are and talking to me the way you've been talking to me. What do you want to come out of this?
I really want to just bring visibility to this issue of sexual coercion and coercive rape, what that looks like, and the fact that it is so common. So many people experience it. And I think you're right that a lot of people do see it as controversial. And I wish that it wasn't, because when it really comes down to it, of course it's rape. Rape is sex without consent.
Right.
And consent can't exist under coercive control. I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Emma Katz. She's based in the UK and a leading expert on coercive control. And she's written about this, how true consensual sex can't exist when there's coercive control. And even when it doesn't look violent and it looks like the victim is going along with it, it doesn't mean there's consent. And all that being said, I would never want to force that label onto another survivor who didn't interpret their own experience as rape or sexual assault. Dr. Katz touches on that as well, that it's really up to the individual survivor to define their own experience. So even if something is on paper sexual assault, it's not really my place to say, oh, you were sexually assaulted or you were raped. I think that label is really personal. But I think there are a lot of people who experience this as a very traumatic violation. And it can be really helpful to have that label. And that's when the true healing can actually begin, because they finally have a word for it that aligns with the level of harm that they felt.
It's part of why it's so controversial, is that very thing right there, that so many people who experience some coercion in some degree, in some aspect of a relationship, even a consensual sexual encounter, may have elements of it that aren't comfortable, but they don't want to be construed as being non-consensual in that encounter. And so you're right, it's so individual and so nuanced in so many aspects at so many levels, which is why I said earlier we could talk about this for hours, because we could dissect so many different aspects of what coercive control is and how some people don't even consider what they are experiencing as coercive control, because they do feel in control still to a large degree, which is fine. Like you said, far be it from you or me or anyone else to label what they're experiencing as coercive control. It's part of why when I first heard the term, it didn't sit well with me. And to some degree still doesn't, because of that nuance and those varying aspects of how people interpret what it means to be controlled. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to put hard labels on things that maybe shouldn't have hard labels on them.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk just for a little bit about the foundation and what you're accomplishing, how successful you've been, where it's going, what the future holds for your work in that regard? How many people you have working with you and pulling for you and wanting the same things? Tell us about it, all that, if you could.
I'm still kind of in the early stages, so it's just me right now, solo mission. But I do have support from other people like the Consent Awareness Network. They've been really helpful since they have gone through this whole process in New York with getting the bill introduced. Right now, I'm really wanting to raise awareness in Iowa. So that's partly my goal with the social media. I also have a petition, so I'm collecting signatures there. So that's another piece that is helpful. And I have connected with some people who are running for the House of Representatives in the midterms. They're very on board with getting this going if they're elected. They're really great. There's a lot of young progressive people running. One of them is, I think she's in her early 20s and she's a survivor herself. And that's something that's really important to her. I think connecting with people here who can see the value in this and really understand why it's important and it's important to them too. That's kind of what I'm focusing on. The ultimate goal, of course, is to get a bill passed that would add this legal definition of consent. And again, that definition is a freely given, knowledgeable, informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason. And I think this is such a complete definition because there are other states that have done this and they've come up with their own definitions, but there's always something that falls a little bit short. Like, for example, the yes means yes definition of consent. Well, yes doesn't always mean yes. A yes that is said under duress is not a true yes. A yes that's coerced, a yes that is said because it doesn't feel safe to say no.
Right.
That's not actually consent. So that's where the freely given comes in. Consent has to be freely given. I think this is really the most complete definition, and I'm so grateful to Joyce Short for coming up with this. You know, she's worked so much on this, and I'm just so grateful that they're allowing me to use this because it really is the best one that I've seen. I think this would really close every gap.
You know, Martha, I wish nothing but the best for all of your efforts with the Iowa legislature, with your push to change the law, but also with your efforts to educate the public through your reels, through your social media, and through being on this show. I can't thank you enough. This has been amazing. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to ask what you're going to do after we are done to take care of yourself emotionally, because when you talk about things that are traumatizing, it always has an impact. No matter how many times you've told your trauma, your brain still reacts in trauma ways. There's reactions and impacts that your brain copes with and deals with. A lot of it has to do with, you may have heard me talk about this numerous times, a lot of it has to do with implicit and explicit memory. So explicit memory is a memory you know you have, and implicit memory is it's in there, you just don't know it yet, and it gets activated by talking about explicit memories. So when those implicit memories come up and you go, oh, I had forgotten about this, or I've never talked about this before because it never popped into my mind before. What will you do with those implicit memories? And what do you do to take care of yourself in your self-care?
When I do have those memories come up, and this happens quite often for me, actually, I think because I do spend so much time thinking about this and talking about it online and making videos about it. I'm constantly remembering, like, oh yeah, this thing happened that I haven't thought about in 2 years. That was really messed up. I have tools to deal with that I've learned in therapy. I think the biggest thing, though, for me has just been journaling, just writing it down. For me, it's like just getting it out is so helpful. And it's part of why I do talk about this so much and part of why I wanted to come on your podcast. It's so healing and therapeutic just to kind of get it out. And whether it's onto, social media or in my journal or saying it out loud to someone, that's so helpful. And then just the somatic healing aspect, moving my body, that always really helps me when things are coming up. So even if it's just going for a walk with my dog, getting out in nature, moving my body somehow, that kind of helps me to move through it and feel grounded again.
Thanks for sharing that. And I do wish all the best to you. And I hope we can do this again. I'd love to get a follow-up conversation going somewhere down the road so we can hear how things are going in terms of getting Iowa law changed.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Great. Thank you, Martha. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. To Martha, my heartfelt thank you. Thank you for your honesty, your courage in telling your story, and your willingness to say things that a lot of people still don't fully understand or aren't ready to hear. What you shared today matters more than even you may realize. For those of you listening, this episode may have challenged what you thought you knew about consent, about what rape looks like, about how control, pressure, and manipulation can operate in ways that are not always obvious, but are absolutely real. If this episode resonated with you in any way, I want you to sit with it, think about it, and talk about it, because this is exactly how we start to change and normalize the conversation. As always, if you or someone you know has a story to share, you can reach out to me directly. You'll find my email address in the episode notes. Please let others know about this episode, and please do what you can to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. A great way to do this is to start by believing. Together, we can help normalize the conversation about the realities of sexual violence, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.